The boy's small fists were braced against the doorframe before the doctor's words had fully left his mouth. Outside, a late autumn blizzard was swallowing the Dakota Territory whole. Inside the drafty infirmary, his sister burned with a fever no one could break. The doctor said only one could stay. He was 8 years old. He refused to move. And that's when the old rancher stepped out of the shadows and changed the course of both their lives forever. The boy was Thomas. His sister, fever-ravaged and barely conscious on the cot, was Eleanor. They were orphans. The frontier hospital had only one rule for critical cases: no children as attendants. But what the doctor saw as defiance, the old rancher saw as the one force that might actually keep the girl alive. He had watched from the corner, a silent witness to a love fierce enough to fight death itself. And in that moment, he decided to bet everything: his authority, his money, and a secret from his own past, on a brother who wouldn't let go. Silas McCrae was not a man known for interference. At 63, he had built the largest cattle spread in the territory through a reputation for granite silence and absolute follow-through. He'd come to Fort Benton's infirmary that night for 3 stitches after a fence post splinter found his palm, a mundane end to a hard day. He expected to be in and out. Then he saw the boy. Thomas stood like a rooted sapling in a gale, his back against the doorframe to the women's ward, his thin shoulders blocking the opening. The doctor, a harried man named Price with spectacles perched on his nose, gestured with exhausted frustration. "Child, you must understand. It is the rule. The air in there is foul with sickness. You will catch it or you will be in the way. An adult relative may sit with her. You are not an adult." "Ain't got no adult," Thomas said, the words a low, rough scrape. He didn't shout. The terror in him had gone past noise into something solid and unmovable. "Then she faces it alone. It is how it is done." This was the truth of frontier medicine. Hospitals, where they existed, were places of last resort and grim arithmetic. Space, clean linen, and the staff's attention were currencies more precious than gold. Children under 12 were seen not as comfort, but as vectors for disease and disruption. The policy was ironclad. It was, in the cold logic of survival, correct. But Silas watched the boy's eyes. They weren't pleading. They were blazing with a kind of furious, helpless love that hit Silas in a place he'd sealed off 40 years prior. He saw the girl, too, in the slice of room visible past Thomas's head. Eleanor, maybe 6 years old, drowning in a rough wool blanket, her skin the color of old wax, her breath hitched in a shallow, terrifying rhythm. Silas knew that rhythm. He had listened to it once, in a different room, holding a different small hand until it went still. The memory arrived not as a wave, but as a sudden, precise puncture in the dam he'd built inside himself. His own son, Peter, had been 8. The fever had been diphtheria. He looked at Dr. Price. "What's she got?" Price, startled by the low, graveled voice from the shadows, turned. "Who's asking?" "Silas McCrae. What's the girl's fever?" Price adjusted his spectacles, recognizing the name. McCrae's influence was the quiet kind, the kind that bought whole sections of rail line without fanfare. "Pneumonia, likely. The wet cold's been brutal. She was brought in by the wagon master of an orphan train. Parents died of cholera back in Independence. The brother here," he nodded at Thomas, "has been glued to her since they arrived 2 days ago. But she's taken a turn. She needs quiet. She needs procedures." Procedures. The word hung in the antiseptic air. It could mean the application of blistering plasters to draw out the illness. It could mean the dreaded bleeding cup. For a child that small, either could be as deadly as the disease. Thomas heard it too. His head snapped toward the doctor, the first crack in his stoic armor. "You ain't cutting on her." It was a snarl, feral and protective. "That is not your decision." Price's patience finally shattered. "Nurse, please remove this child to the waiting bench. If he resists, fetch the marshal." A stout nurse moved forward, her expression a mixture of pity and resolve. Thomas braced, his fists coming up not to strike her but to better grip the wooden frame, melting himself into it. The scene was seconds from becoming a brutal, shameful spectacle. "Hold on." Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The two words dropped into the tension carried the weight of all his years and all his acres. The nurse stopped. Price turned. Silas pushed himself off the wall, his heavy coat whispering. He walked past the doctor, past the nurse, and knelt with a soft creak of leather on the rough plank floor. He was now eye level with Thomas. He didn't touch him. Not yet. "You're Thomas." The boy stared, chest heaving, suspicious of this new player. "Your sister's name is Alina. You've been taking care of her since Missouri." A tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "You think if you let go of this door, you're letting go of her. That if you can't see her, she might just disappear." Thomas's jaw trembled. The angry tears that had been held back by sheer force of will now welled, magnifying the fierce, desperate light in his eyes. It was all the confirmation Silas needed. He felt exactly that way once. He'd let go because the adults told him to. He never forgiven himself for it. "Hear what I know," Silas said, his voice so quiet only Thomas could hear. "A body fighting that hard needs an anchor, something to tie it to this world, to give it a reason to keep breathing when it gets tired. Medicine can't be that anchor. Only people can." He slowly, deliberately raised his hands and placed them on Thomas's rigid shoulders. The boy flinched but didn't pull away. The touch was firm, grounding, a solid connection in a world spinning out of control. "I'm going to make you a promise, son, and I don't make those lightly. You let the nurse pass. You sit right there on that bench where you can see the door, and I will go in with the doctor. I will not leave her side, and I will not let him do a single thing to her that I don't believe will help. You have my word on it." Thomas searched his face. He was looking for lies, for the slick condescension of adults who promised easy things. What he found was a landscape of old grief and new, unwavering resolve. It was a face that had nothing left to lose by telling the truth. "Why?" Thomas whispered the word ragged. "Because a long time ago, nobody knelt down for me," Silas said. For a long, suspended moment, the only sound was Alina's ragged breathing from the room. Then, Thomas's grip on the doorframe loosened. His shoulders sagged under Silas's hands, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a colossal, trembling exhaustion. He took one step back, then another. The path was clear. Silas stood, his knees protesting. He gave Thomas a single, firm nod. Then he turned to Dr. Price, whose mouth was slightly agape. "The boy stays on the bench. He stays in sight. I am going in with you. You will explain every step to me, and we will try the new way first." Price blinked. "The new way, Mr. McCrae, with respect, you are not a medical man. The practices we employ are standard." "The standard saw my father drained of 2 pints of blood for a broken leg. He died of weakness. I am not arguing." Silas's tone left no room for it. "I read the Eastern journals that come on the rail. I know about steam tents for the lungs. I know about cool compresses for fever, not ice baths. You have the supplies. We will use them." Price was caught between professional indignation and the terrifying, practical reality of Silas McCrae's influence in the territory. The promise of a generous donation to his underfunded infirmary warred with the violation of his authority. But the look in Silas's eyes wasn't one of negotiation. It was a declaration. Swallowing his pride, Price gave a tight jerk of his head. "Very well, nurse, prepare a steam kettle and fetch some extra blankets. We will try to break the fever with perspiration, not shock." He turned and strode into the sick room, the nurse scurrying ahead. Silas took one last look at Thomas, who had collapsed onto the hard wooden bench, his small body curled in on itself, his eyes fixed on the doorway like a lifeline. Then, Silas McCrae, cattle baron, man of solitude, stepped across the threshold into the sour-smelling dark, following the sound of a little girl struggling to breathe. He thought he was stepping in to monitor a doctor. He had no idea he was walking directly into a conspiracy that had already claimed lives, a conspiracy that would see Alina's fever not as a tragedy, but as a convenient accident. And the first clue was the man he saw already standing in the shadowed corner of the sick room, a man who was definitely not a medic, who watched Alina with the cold, assessing eyes of a bookkeeper balancing a ledger. The man in the corner was not there to observe. He was there to audit. He wore a city suit, gone shiny at the elbows, and held a small leather-bound ledger. His eyes, when they flickered from Alina's still form to Sela's, held no doctor's concern, only a flat, calculating impatience. He was waiting for something, her final breath perhaps, to make a tidy notation. Silas's presence disrupted the equation. Dr. Price, flustered, began preparing the steam kettle, the nurse draping a tent of sheets over the bed. But Silas kept his gaze on the stranger. "You are not staff." The man closed his ledger with a soft snap. "Mr. McCrae, I've heard your name. I am Alastair Finch, representing the Western Children's Aid Society of Chicago." His voice was dry, precise, devoid of warmth. "The child is a ward of the society until placement. My role is to oversee the disposition of such cases." Disposition. Silas repeated the word, letting its coldness hang in the humid air now filling with the smell of eucalyptus and hot water. In cases of terminal illness, there are forms, financial reconciliations. The society bears the cost of burial, you see, which must be accounted for against the initial transport fees. Finch spoke as if discussing damaged freight. A white-hot wire of anger threaded through Silas's chest. He looked at Alina, her face just visible in the steam, her struggle so profound and private. Then he looked back at Finch. "Get out." Finch's eyebrows lifted slightly. "I have a right to be here. This is society business." "This is my business now," Silas said, taking a single step forward. The difference in their stature, the rancher's broad, weathered strength against the clerk's pinched frame, was suddenly the only thing in the room. "You can walk out or I can carry you out. Your ledger won't help you either way." Finch's composure cracked, revealing a petulant spite underneath. "Your sentiment is noted and wasteful. The doctor will confirm the prognosis is grave. My report will reflect that interference prolonged the child's suffering, and the brother outside will need disposition as well. We have a contract for him with a mining family in Butte. They pay a premium for boys who are sturdy." The pieces, cold and jagged, slotted together in Silas's mind. This wasn't just bureaucracy, it was a system. The sick child was a line item to be closed. The healthy brother was an asset to be transferred, his grief irrelevant, his bond to his sister a nuisance. The promise he had just made to Thomas, kneeling on that floor, became a physical weight. It was a promise not just against fever, but against this. "Your report," Silas said softly, "will wait. Nurse, see this gentleman to the door. Ensure he finds a seat in the waiting area, a far seat." The nurse, emboldened by Silas's authority, gestured firmly. Finch, with a last venomous glance at the bed, retreated, his ledger tucked protectively under his arm. For the next 12 hours, Silas McCrae did not leave Alina's side. He ignored the protest of his old knees, the ache in his back. He helped the nurse change the sweat-soaked sheets. He followed Price's instructions, but with a watchful eye that demanded gentleness. He watched the girl's chest rise and fall, a tiny bellows fighting against a terrible weight. And in the quiet moments, he talked to her. He didn't know what to say to a little girl, so he told her about the land. About the creek on his property that ran clear and cold, about the dumb bravery of new calves, about the way the prairie sky could turn 1,000 colors at sunset. He told her Thomas was right outside, being brave for her. He was describing the sound of wind through tall grass when her eyelids fluttered, not opening but the frantic movement behind them stilled. Her breathing, while still labored, deepened just a fraction. Price, checking her pulse, let out a slow breath. The crisis may be passing. The steam, it seems to be helping. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was a foothold. As a gray dawn lightened the window, Price slumped in a chair, exhausted. "I will check again in an hour. She needs sleep, real sleep." Silas stepped out into the hall, his body stiff, his mind gritty with fatigue. Thomas was exactly where he'd left him, curled on the bench but awake, his eyes locked onto Sela's. "She's still fighting," Sela said, his voice rough from the long night. "The fever's a bit lower. She just now found a proper sleep." The boy uncurled, a tremor of hope moving through him. He didn't speak. He just nodded, absorbing the news as if it were rations in a famine. Finch was also still there, seated primly across the room, writing in his ledger. He looked up, his expression unreadable. Silas ignored him and walked to the infirmary's front desk, where a young clerk was dozing. "The orphan train wagon master," Silas said. "Where is he staying?" The clerk jerked awake. "Mr. Dobson, he's at the Great Northern Hotel, but he's been taken poorly himself. Took a room 2 days ago and hasn't been down." A cold trickle of suspicion dripped down Silas's spine. The man who brought the children in falls ill right after. What's his room number? 20 minutes later, Silas stood outside room 207 of the Great Northern. He knocked. No answer. A maid passing with linens gave him a worried look. "Ain't seen him come out, mister. Heard a powerful cough yesterday." Silas tried the door. It was unlocked. The room was dark, the air stale and thick with a sweet, sickly smell. A man lay in the bed, covers pulled to his chin. Silas approached. Jacob Dobson was a man in his 50s, with a kind, weathered face now slack and pale. He was dead, but not from a cough. His lips were tinged a faint, unnatural blue. On the bedside table sat an empty glass and a small, brown glass bottle with no label. Silas picked up the bottle, sniffed it. The sweet odor was stronger. Laudanum, a common pain tincture. But an overdose could slow the breath until it stopped, especially in a weakened man. It could look like natural causes. It could look like the sickness that took his charges had finally caught him. He searched the room quickly, methodically. In Dobson's worn satchel under a spare shirt, he found a bundle of letters tied with string. They were from the Western Children's Aid Society, formal acknowledgments of children received. But one, dated just 3 weeks prior, was different. It was a private letter to Dobson from none other than Alastair Finch. "Jacob, your consistent losses among the older or infirm children prior to final placement are noted. While the Society appreciates the reduction in long-term care costs, the frequency draws attention. The girl, Elena, is a clear candidate. Ensure the matter is resolved before reaching Fort Benton, where the territorial inspector is known to be overly sentimental. The bonus for discreet closures remains yours upon verified report." Silas's blood turned to ice. Discreet closures, verified report. This wasn't negligence. It was policy. A secret, profitable culling of children deemed too sick, too much trouble to be worth the cost of placement. Dobson was the executioner, and now he was a loose end, neatly tied off by the very poison he likely used on others. Finch, the auditor, was here not just to close Eleanor's file, but to verify Dobson's work and then silence the silencer. He stuffed the letters inside his coat. As he turned to leave, his boot knocked against a chamber pot tucked by the bed. It wasn't empty. Inside, amid the usual waste, were the remains of a hearty meal: potato, bread, stewed meat. A man dying of a sudden, violent lung sickness does not digest a full supper. Dobson had been healthy when he ate this. Then he'd been given a dose of medicine. Silas left the room, closing the door softly behind him. He walked down the stairs and out into the sharp morning air, but the chill he felt was from within. He had walked into a sick room to honor a promise to a boy. He had stumbled into a murder. He went straight to the telegraph office. He sent 2 wires. The first was to his lawyer in Helena, demanding every piece of information on the Western Children's Aid Society, its charter, its board members, and any territorial or federal inspections. The second was to an old friend, a former U.S. Marshal named Eli Vance, who now worked as a Pinkerton detective out of Denver. The message was blunt: need investigation into deaths of children under care of Western Children's Aid. Suspect systematic poisoning for profit. Auditor named Finch currently in Fort Benton. Wagon Master Dobson dead, likely murdered. Urgent. He had just paid for the telegrams when a hand fell on his shoulder. He turned to find the town marshal, a solid man named Carver with a tired face. "Silas, need you to come with me." "What's this about, Ben?" "About you threatening a representative of a charitable society in a hospital last night. About you being the last person seen going into Jacob Dobson's room this morning. A maid got nervous, came to me. Dobson's been found dead, and Mr. Finch from the society is claiming you have a dangerous fixation on these orphan children and may have harmed Dobson to cover something up." Finch had moved fast. He'd taken Silas's interference and spun it into a narrative of guilt. The respected rancher, unhinged by grief over a dead son years past, becomes obsessed with a dying girl, eliminates the man who brought her, and threatens the society's agent. It was clever. It had the veneer of truth. Silas didn't resist. He walked with Marshal Carver to the small jailhouse. As they walked, he saw Finch standing outside the infirmary, ledger in hand, watching them pass. A small, cold smile touched the man's lips. In the bare cell, Silas sat on the cot. He had the condemning letters, but revealing them now would see them lost by a marshal who was, at best, neutral. He needed someone on the outside. He thought of Thomas, alone on that bench, with only a fragile promise between him and the wolves. "Ben," Silas said through the bars, "send for my foreman, Clyde Dawson. Tell him to come to the jail. And Ben, check on the boy at the infirmary, the brother. Make sure he's all right, as a favor to me." Carver sighed, rubbing his face. "I'll have my deputy look in. But Silas, this looks bad. A dead man, threats made in front of witnesses. Finch is talking about getting a territorial judge involved." It was mid-afternoon when Clyde Dawson arrived, his face grim under his hat brim. Clyde was in his 40s, loyal as a saint and tough as saddle leather. Silas spoke quickly, quietly through the bars. "Listen close. There's a little girl in the infirmary named Alina. Her brother Thomas is with her. They are not to be left alone, not for a second. You or one of our boys needs to be in that hallway, visible at all times. A man named Finch wants her dead. He may try to bribe a nurse or get a corrupt doctor to give her the wrong medicine. You guard that door like it's the gate to heaven itself." Clyde didn't ask questions, he nodded. "Done, what else?" "Get to the telegraph office. Watch for a reply from Eli Vance or from my lawyer. Bring it straight to me, no matter who tries to stop you. And Clyde, be ready. This is going to get worse before it gets better." As Clyde left on his mission, Silas was left with the silence of the cell. His empire of cattle and land meant nothing here. His word, his reputation, was being dismantled piece by a clerk with a ledger. He had bet everything on a brother who wouldn't let go. Now, he was the one in a cage, and the boy's anchor was under threat from a shadow he couldn't fight with fists or fortune. He stared at the wall, imagining Finch's next move. The man didn't need to kill Alina with his own hands now. He just needed to create enough delay, enough chaos for the pneumonia to finish its work. Or he could have her transferred, for her own good, to a facility he controlled. With Silas jailed and discredited, who would stop him? The answer came with the sound of boots in the hallway. It was Clyde. It was Marshal Carver with Finch beside him and a third man, a stern-looking stranger in a fine overcoat. "Silas McCrae," Carver said, his voice formal. "This is Judge Andrew Warrener, Circuit Court. He's come to hear the complaint against you. Mr. Finch has formally petitioned for the immediate transfer of the minor, Alina, to a specialized sanatorium in Billings for her care, citing your obstruction and the inadequacy of local facilities. The judge has granted an emergency hearing. In 1 hour." Finch looked at Silas through the bars, his cold eyes glittering with triumph. The bureaucratic machinery was in motion, and in 1 hour it would legally strip away the last defense of a little girl who had just started to breathe easier. Silas had run out of time, and he was locked in a cage. The hearing was not in a courtroom. It was in the infirmary's supply closet, cleared out to serve as a judge's chamber. This was by design to keep it fast, private, and away from public scrutiny. Silas was brought in, his wrists shackled and made to stand before a plank table where Judge Warrener sat. Finch stood to one side, his ledger open like a Bible. Dr. Price hovered nervously by the door, and on a stool in the corner, silent and pale, sat Thomas, brought in by the deputy. The boy's eyes were huge, fixed on Silas. Warrener was a man who valued procedure over passion. He looked at Silas over his spectacles. "Mr. McCrae, you are not formally charged, but you are detained on suspicion. This is a separate civil matter regarding the welfare of a minor aliener. Mr. Finch has petitioned for emergency transfer. You may speak to that." Silas took a breath, the chains on his wrists feeling less like restraints and more like a symbol of the entire rotten system. "Your Honor, the girl is improving. Dr. Price can confirm. Transferring her on a jolting wagon to Billings in her condition is a death sentence. It is what Mr. Finch wants. He is not here for her welfare. He is here to close a file." Finch made a soft, dismissive sound. "Emotional conjecture. The Society's sanatorium in Billings has a ventilated carriage and a staff physician. It is far superior to this frontier outpost. My concern is the child's best medical interest." "Then why," Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm, "was the wagon master who brought these children, Jacob Dobson, found dead this morning? Not from illness. Poisoned. And why do I have in my possession a letter from you to Dobson, instructing him to ensure a discreet closure of the girl's case before arrival here?" The room went very still. Finch's face tightened, but he didn't flinch. A desperate forgery, the ramblings of a man trying to distract from his own violence. "Where is this alleged letter?" "Safe," Silas said, "and it's not alone." Judge Warrener held up a hand. "This is a custody hearing, not a murder inquest. The matter of Dobson is for the marshal. We are here to decide if the child stays or goes. Dr. Price." Price stepped forward, wringing his hands. "The girl, her fever broke 2 hours ago. She is weak, but the crisis has passed. With continued care here, rest, and proper nourishment, I believe she will recover. A journey now would be extremely risky." It was the first piece of good news, a sliver of light. Thomas straightened on his stool, a flash of pure hope in his eyes. Finch was ready. "Ah, but continued care here." "What care?" "This infirmary has one overworked doctor, 2 nurses, and is funded by territorial charity that ran out last month. The bed she occupies is needed for a paying patient with a compound fracture. I have here," he produced a document, "a signed statement from the infirmary's board chairman, agreeing that non-critical patients must be transferred to free up resources. The girl is no longer critical, therefore she must be moved. It is a simple matter of logistics and finance." He had outmaneuvered them. He turned her recovery against her. Price looked stricken. He hadn't known about the board statement. The judge nodded, taking the paper. "The authority of the local institution must be respected. My ruling is that the transfer to the Billings sanatorium may proceed with all due care taken. The child shall be prepared to depart at first light tomorrow." "No," the word wasn't a shout. It was a low, raw sound from the corner. Thomas had stood up, his small fists clenched. "You can't," he promised. He was looking at Silas, his world crumbling again. Finch smiled, a thin, cruel thing. "The emotional attachments of children are fleeting. He will be placed in his new situation and forget." "Like you forgot Jacob Dobson." Silas's chains rattled as he took a half-step forward, ignoring the deputy's hand on his arm. He locked eyes with the judge. "Andrew, you've known me 20 years. You've dined at my table. You know what I've built, and you know I don't make accusations lightly. That man," he jerked his head at Finch, "is part of a scheme that profits from the deaths of unwanted children. He had Dobson killed. He will have that girl killed on the road or in that sanatorium, which is probably just a painted shack. And if you sanction this, her blood won't just be on his hands. It will be on yours. You want that in your ledger when the real investigation starts." Judge Warrener's face paled. The use of his first name, the personal appeal, the sheer weight of Silas's reputation gave him pause. He was a man of the law, but the law here was a thin veneer over raw power and older loyalties. He looked from Silas's furious, credible face to Finch's cold, bureaucratic one. "The ruling stands," Warrener said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "However, given the unusual allegations, I will add a proviso. The transfer will not occur until 48 hours have passed to allow for the child to gain strength. And Mr. McCrae, you will remain detained pending the marshal's investigation into Dobson's death. If your claims have merit, produce your evidence to the marshal within that time." It was a compromise, a stay of execution but not a victory. Silas was being returned to his cell and the clock was ticking. 48 hours. As the deputy led him out, he passed Thomas. The boy looked up at him, not with betrayal but with a desperate, silent question. "What now?" Silas could only give the slightest nod. "Hold on." Back in his cell, the despair was a physical weight. He had the letters, but they were just words. He needed a witness. He needed someone from inside the society. And then he remembered something Finch had said in the sick room. "The bonus for discreet closures remains yours upon verified report." Verified report. That meant paperwork. A paper trail that didn't just order deaths, but paid for them. He was packing when Clyde returned, his face grim. He had a telegraph slip in his hand. "From your lawyer," Clyde said, passing it through the bars. "And Vance is on his way, but he's 3 days out." Silas read the telegram. His lawyer had dug fast. The Western Children's Aid Society was a legitimate charter, but its financials were a maze of subcontracts and private disbursements. One name kept appearing as a recipient of transport and final care funds: the Meadowvale Sanatorium and Farm, Billings, Montana. The same destination for a leaner. But the lawyer had found a land registry. The Meadowvale property was owned by a shell company, which was owned by another company, which traced back to a silent partner, Alastair Finch. It wasn't just a job for Finch. It was his business. He was being paid twice, once by the society to place children, and again by his own sanatorium to dispose of the unprofitable ones, pocketing all the funds. Dobson had been a subcontractor, a murderer on a salary, and now he was a liability erased. "Clyde," Silas said, his mind racing, "I need you to find someone. A nurse, an orderly, anyone who worked for Dobson on the orphan train before it got here. They might have seen something, known something. Someone who's scared. Offer them protection. Offer them money. Bring them to me." Clyde nodded and vanished. The day bled into another cold night. Silas didn't sleep. He listened to the town sounds, each one a reminder of time slipping away. Just before dawn, Clyde returned, and he wasn't alone. With him was a young woman, no older than 20, wrapped in a shawl, her face pinched with fear. She was introduced as Mary, the orphan train's cook and laundress. "She was in the hotel kitchen," Clyde said quietly. "Hiding, saw me asking around and came forward." Mary's story poured out in a frightened whisper. She worked for Dobson for 3 runs. She described how the sickly children would get a special tonic at night from Dobson's private bottle. They'd be quiet by morning and gone by the next stop, listed as deceased en route or transferred to local care. She'd suspected but needed the work. This time, she said, Dobson had been nervous. He argued with Finch when the agent met the train a week before Fort Benton. Finch wanted the girl, Eleanor, dealt with before the territorial border. Dobson had refused, saying she wasn't that sick yet, that it was too obvious. The next day, Dobson got the bottle of medicine for his own cough from Finch. He was dead a day later. "Do you know what was in the bottle?" Silas asked. Mary shook her head. "But I saved it, the one from before. After a little boy died in Nebraska, I couldn't. I took the bottle he used from the trash. I have it." From her pocket, she drew out a small brown vial, identical to the one in Dobson's room. "I was too scared to show anyone." It was physical evidence, a weapon. Just as Silas took the vial, Marshal Carver came down the hallway, his face grave. He unlocked the cell. "McCrae, you need to come. Now it's the boy." A bolt of pure fear shot through Silas. "Thomas. Not hurt, but he's gone, and he's taken his sister." Silas erupted from the cell, pushing past the marshal, Clyde, and Mary following. They ran through the empty streets to the infirmary. The scene inside was chaos. Dr. Price was frantic. Eleanor's bed was empty. The window in the women's ward, which had been nailed shut for winter, was pried open, the nails bent back. On the floor by Thomas's bench lay a small, folded piece of paper. Silas snatched it up. It was a child's drawing done in charcoal on the back of a handbill, a crude but clear picture of a creek, a sun, and two stick figures holding hands. Underneath, in labored print, "Gone to the creek. Be safe." Thomas, believing the adults had failed, had taken matters into his own hands. He'd somehow pried open a window, gathered his barely conscious sister in her blanket, and vanished into the pre-dawn freeze with a dying girl, heading for the only safe place he could imagine from Silas's stories, the creek on McCrae's land. Finch, who had arrived at the commotion, let out a sound of disgust. "You see, the instability you fostered. The child is delirious, kidnapping his own sister. She will be dead in a ditch within the hour. This is on your head, McCrae." But Silas was already moving, the vial of poison clutched in his hand, the child's drawing in the other. The legal battle, the hearings, the conspiracy, it was all irrelevant now. The story had boiled down to its most essential elements: a sick little girl, her fierce brother, and the freezing wilderness. And Silas McCrae was the only one who knew where they were going. He turned to Clyde, his voice iron. "Get the horses. Get every man we have. We're riding for home. And Marshal," he looked at Carver, "you're welcome to come. The evidence you need is in this vial, and the man who ordered it all is standing right there. Your choice." He didn't wait for an answer. He ran into the biting dawn, not as a prisoner or a rancher, but as the only anchor two lost children had left in a world that wanted to erase them. The race was no longer against a judge's order. It was against the cold and time and the desperate courage of a boy who had finally decided to run. They found the first clue 2 miles out of town, a scrap of wool blanket snagged on a barbed wire fence, trembling in the wind. Silas reined in his horse, his heart a hammer against his ribs. The boy was following the creek road just as the drawing promised, but it was 17 miles to McCrae land, and the temperature was dropping with the rising sun. A bitter, deceptive cold that promised frostbite and worse. He turned in his saddle. Behind him were Clyde and 3 of his most trusted hands, armed and grim. Marshal Carver had come too, though he looked conflicted, his duty warring with the story unfolding. Alastair Finch had insisted on accompanying them, a smug vulture in a borrowed coat, claiming a right to witness the tragic outcome. Silas didn't have time to argue. Every second was a currency more precious than gold. They rode hard, following the meager trail, a scuff in the frost here, a tiny footprint in a patch of mud there. Thomas was carrying his sister. The thought was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The boy was 8, small for his age, carrying a 6-year-old who was still weak from fever. They couldn't have gotten far. They found the second clue at the 5-mile mark, a small, worn leather shoe discarded in the middle of the road. Silas dismounted and picked it up. It was Eleanor's. His throat tightened. Had she kicked it off in delirium, or had Thomas, realizing the weight was too much, stripped it off to lighten his load? It meant they were still moving, but it also meant they were getting desperate. Finch let out a sigh that was meant to sound sorrowful. A sad, predictable end. The boy will be found frozen, clutching his sister. A poignant, if wasteful, conclusion to the file. Silas turned and looked at him, and the rage in his eyes was so pure and cold it silenced the man. "If they die, Finch, you won't live to file the report. That's not a threat, it's a fact." They pushed on. The landscape opened up, rolling prairie giving way to the pine-studded hills that marked the edge of Silas's property. The wind picked up, whipping through the grass with a sound like a morning whisper. And then Clyde pointed. "Smoke. thin column up near the bend of the creek. It wasn't from a chimney. It was a campfire, too small, too poorly made. Hope, fierce and desperate, flared in Silas's chest. He kicked his horse into a gallop, leaving the others behind. He found them in a shallow gully where the creek bank curved, sheltered slightly from the wind. Thomas had managed to gather a pitiful handful of twigs and dead grass, sparking it to life with what must have been a stolen match. The fire was feeble, more smoke than flame. Alina was wrapped in the remains of the blanket, curled against her brother's side. Her eyes were closed. Thomas was rubbing her arms frantically, his own face blue with cold, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. He was whispering to her the same words over and over. "Stay awake, Ellie, just stay awake. He's coming," he promised. Silas was off his horse before it had fully stopped. He crashed down the bank, shedding his heavy coat as he ran. Thomas looked up, and the expression on his face wasn't joy, it was a profound, gut-wrenching surrender. He had done all he could. He had run out of strength. "I got you, son," Silas said, his voice breaking. He didn't go to Alina first. He went to Thomas, wrapping his massive coat around the boy's shivering frame, pulling him into a brief, crushing embrace. "You did good, you did so good." Then he turned to Alina. He felt for her pulse. It was there, thready and faint, but there. Her skin was cold, but not the terrible marble cold of death. She was alive, exhausted, freezing, but alive. The others arrived, clattering down the bank. Finch took in the scene, his lips pressed into a thin line. "She requires immediate professional care. This squatter's hovel is not sufficient. Marshall, as a representative of her legal guardian." "She's not going anywhere with you." Silas didn't look up. He was chafing Alina's small hands, willing warmth back into them. "You have no authority." Finch's composure finally shattered into shrill indignation. "The court order is void," a new voice said. Everyone turned. Emerging from the tree line on a lathered horse was Eli Vance, the Pinkerton detective. He must have ridden through the night. He tipped his hat to Silas, then fixed his gaze on Finch. "Alastair Finch, I have a federal warrant for your arrest, issued an hour ago by a judge in Helena who received some very interesting telegraphs. Conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, trafficking in indentured servitude. The list is long and ugly." Finch went bone-white. "On what evidence?" Eli nodded to Silas. "The letters you wrote to Dobson, the testimony of Mary, the cook, and this." He held up a small, identical brown vial. "The one from Dobson's room. The marshal's deputy brought it to me. A chemist in Helena identified it as a concentrated tincture of opium and arsenic, enough to kill a child with a few drops or a man with a dose. Same as in the vial your former employee saved. Seems you have a signature blend." Marshal Carver, seeing the shift in power, finally moved. He stepped forward and took Finch by the arm. "You're coming with me." Finch looked around, a cornered rat. His eyes landed on Thomas, who was watching silently from within Silas's coat. "This changes nothing. The society will appoint another agent. Those children are property of the state." "No," Silas said, standing up, Alina now cradled securely in his arms. "They're not." He looked at Eli. "What does it take?" Eli understood. Given the circumstances and the evidence of systematic endangerment by their appointed guardian, a petition for emergency custody would be fast-tracked, especially if filed by a citizen of standing, with the resources to provide care. A judge might look very favorably on it, particularly with a federal agent and a territorial marshal prepared to testify to the alternative. Silas looked at Carver. The marshal gave a slow, definite nod. "I'll testify." It was done. The machinery that Finch had wielded so cruelly was now turning against him, grinding him to dust. As Carver led the sputtering, defeated man away, Silas turned his attention back to the children. He got Thomas onto his horse, wrapping him tightly. He handed Alina up to Clyde, who held her with surprising gentleness. Then Silas mounted up behind Thomas, taking the girl back into his own arms. He held them both, the boy in front of him, the girl against his chest, as they made the slow, careful ride back to the heart of the McCrae ranch. The next week was a blur of quiet activity. Eleanor, placed in a proper bed before a roaring fireplace, attended by a doctor paid by Silas, began a true recovery. Color returned to her cheeks. Her breath lost its rattle. Thomas rarely left her side, but the fierce, angry terror in his eyes gradually softened into a watchful, weary peace. Silas's lawyer worked miracles. The emergency custody petition was granted. The Western Children's Aid Society, under the glare of a federal investigation and sensational newspaper reports, dissolved its Montana operations. Finch, facing multiple counts of murder, cut a deal, implicating higher-ups in Chicago in exchange for avoiding the gallows. The system had been exposed, if not fully dismantled. One evening, Silas sat on the porch of the main house, looking out over his land. The door opened and Thomas stepped out, holding a piece of paper. He walked over and handed it to Silas without a word. It was a new drawing. This one showed a house, a creek, a sun, and three stick figures, a tall one, a medium one, and a small one, all holding hands. Underneath it said, "Oh, you are home." Silas looked at it for a long time, the simplicity of it piercing through 40 years of accumulated solitude. He looked at Thomas. "Is that what you want?" Thomas nodded, his eyes serious. "Ellie does too. She don't say it yet, but she does. It's a big ranch. Needs a lot of looking after. Could use a couple of good hands." A small, tentative smile touched Thomas's lips. It was the first Silas had ever seen. The final piece fell into place a month later when the formal adoption papers arrived. There was no fanfare. Silas signed them at his desk, with Thomas and Eleanor, now healthy and wearing new clothes that fit, watching. He blotted the ink and looked at them. "It's done," he said. Eleanor, who had been mostly silent, walked over and put her hand in his. She looked up at him with her mother's dark eyes, clear and free of fever. "Papa," she said, testing the word. It was the surprise he hadn't known he was waiting for. It landed in the center of his chest, gentle and seismic, filling a hollow space he'd carried since a sick room long ago. He looked at Thomas, who gave a firm, approving nod. The boy had already decided. Silas McCrae, the man who never interfered, gathered his children close. The frontier stretched out beyond the windows, vast and unforgiving. But in that room, for the first time in 6 decades, he was no longer just surviving it. He was building something new right in the middle of it, anchored by 2 small, fierce loves he'd pulled back from the brink. We often think of the frontier as a place defined by the grand gesture, the drawn pistol, the land rush, the gold strike. But the story of Silas McCrae suggests something else, that the most transformative forces were often the quiet ones. A man kneeling down in the dust to meet the eyes of a child, a promise spoken softly against the roar of a blizzard, a decision not to ride on. What happened in that infirmary wasn't just a medical intervention. It was a human one. Silas saw in Thomas's defiant stand not disobedience, but the purest form of loyalty. He recognized a language he himself had forgotten, the language of staying. And by choosing to speak it again, he didn't just save 2 lives. He unraveled a conspiracy, toppled a corrupt system, and reclaimed a family from the very machinery built to grind them into ledger entries. The McCrae Ranch still stands in Montana. The creek still runs clear. And if you visit, locals will tell you it's still run by the McCrae family. Thomas took over its operations in 1921, applying the same fierce, protective intelligence he'd once used to guard a sick-room door. Eleanor became a teacher, then a nurse, dedicating her life to the very kind of care that had saved her. They never forgot the man who knelt down. They built their lives on the foundation of that single, simple act of belief. The story asks a lingering question of us all. In a world that often values efficiency over compassion, systems over souls, when do we choose to kneel down? When do we decide that the rules, however logical, are not as important as the person in front of us? Silas McCrae was not seeking redemption. He was just getting 3 stitches. But he was present enough to witness a small, profound courage, and brave enough to match it with his own. That is the real legacy of the story. It's a reminder that our greatest moments are rarely the ones we plan. They are the ones we stumble into, armed with nothing but our own fractured history and the choice to do better, to be someone's anchor, to be the chance. If this story of quiet courage resonated with you, hit that subscribe button below. It tells the algorithm you want more narratives that dig beneath the surface, finding the profound in the unspoken. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply not look away. Thanks for listening.